Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aldebaran Resources Live Summit today. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, their CEO, John Black, as well as their Chief Geological Officer, Dr. Kevin Heather. John and Kevin are going to be taking us through the company's latest news, and following that, there's going to be a live Q&A session. Feel free to submit any questions that you have using the Q&A chat found on the right-hand side of your screen at any time today, but also feel free to fill out the survey that we've linked in the chat if you're interested in contacting the Aldebaran management team at any time. As always, the summit is going to be recorded and it'll be available on 6.com afterwards. So look out for that. And without further ado, John, I'm going to pass things over to you to get us started.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, Cam. And I'd like to thank Romeo and Cam and the entire CuEq team once again for this format. This is something we find quite useful from our perspective to be able to communicate results quickly and then get some feedback and some good questions and answers and an opportunity to interact with people that are interested in following this story. It's a particularly good session for us right now because we have some very exciting news to put out today, and I'm even more pleased that the labs kind of picked up their speed and we're able to get these results in ahead of next week's big PDAC gathering. It looks like we'll probably have a record attendance in Toronto next week, and it's setting up to be a very fun week as we'll be able to help everybody understand the importance of these results coming out and the potential that these really open up. So if any of you are going to be in Toronto next week, please stop by and see us there. So without any further ado, I think what I'll do is turn it over to Kevin, and Kevin's going to walk us through what these results are that we put out today, and more importantly, what these mean, what this is indicating for the future of the project. So Kevin, take it over.
Oh, great. Thanks, John, and thanks to the guys at CuEq. As per usual, we'll move through fairly quickly and hopefully leave sufficient time at the end for questions and answers. The typical disclaimer, I will be making some forward-looking statements, and those who know me know that I do that. For those that might be new to the story, just a real quick orientation. We're in northwestern Argentina in the province of San Juan. It's a very pro-mining province. It's host to a number of very large gold deposits, plus even larger copper projects that are currently under exploration or in the early stages of development. You can see the Altar Copper Gold Project located down here very close to the border with Chile. We're located about 25 kilometers north of the operating Las Palambres mine in Chile of Antofagasta Minerals, and 25 kilometers north of El Pachon's, the Glencore's El Pachon project, another very large copper moly porphyry system. And then about 50 kilometers to the north of us, McEwen Copper's Los Azules deposit. So we're definitely in elephant country here. Just a quick refresher. The current resource at Altar is already very large. There's a significant amount of the resource, a little over 11 billion pounds of copper and 3.4 million ounces of gold in the measured and indicated categories, and then a lesser amount of 1.7 billion pounds of copper in the inferred category. And that all sits within this conceptual pit that you can see here. We have significant amount of drilling indicating the mineralization does extend to depth. And I'll particularly note this area right in here where we have a little bit of a hump in the bottom of the pit because that's really where the focus of today's discussion is going to be. And then we have another porphyry center located 3 kilometers to the west called the Radio Porphyry. That's currently not in resource, but will be included in a resource update the next time we do one. So just a bit of background. Last year, we put out results from holes 220 and 221. And 221 was quite a significant hole. You can see it located right here. And it also, today we'll be discussing hole 222 that was released this morning, and hole 223, which is really, I think, the high impact hole and has a lot of significance here. And then I've also put on here where we have 3 rigs turning at the moment. We have a rig here on platform 224, 225, and 226. So we have 3 rigs active at the moment. So those will remember from previous webinars, This is the conceptual pit outline here in white. And what I've superimposed on here is some of the three-dimensional magnetotelluric resistivity results that we got from last year geophysical survey. And I've put those in plan view so that you can see the location of this very, very large resistivity feature. And we'll be seeing that throughout the presentation. So again, to refresh the significance of 221, we'll look at a cross section AA prime, and we'll be looking towards the north. So there's the section. You can see the conceptual pit outline. And I think the first thing you can notice here is that many of the historic drill holes were never drilled deep enough even to make it to the current pit bottom. And you can see where hole 221 sits. And we hit long intercepts of what I would consider as low to moderate grade. But the importance of this is that this was drilled in an area within this large resistivity feature. And you can see that that hole more or less hit the center part on this section of that resistivity feature. And you can see it's contiguously mineralized. And what I've done here now is I've superimposed onto that resistivity feature the existing block model. And you can see the pit shell here. And all of these blocks up in here are the ones that are currently reporting to the resource. And you can see that hole 221 sits in an area in the pit where there's very little resource blocks and also no resource blocks immediately below the pit bottom. And again, where this little hump in the bottom of the pit is. Okay, so before we dive into looking at the results of the new hole, I want to point you to the significance of these results. And I think it's all in the quotes that were in today's press release. These really are the place that you should go to first, because these give you what John and my opinion of the hole is. And you got to remember that we're not only just explorationists running Aldebaran, but we're also significant shareholders. So we're aligned with many of you in wanting to see this project be successful. And so I've highlighted two, I think, important parts. I urge you to read the entire quotes, but I've just highlighted two here. And the first one by John is, anytime you intersect over 1 kilometer of good grade mineralization is exciting. In the exploration world, kilometer plus intercepts of contiguous mineralization are not common. And the second quote that I will put you is one that I made, is that I really think that hole 223 should be viewed as a new brownfield discovery hole, especially considering that it's drilled into a previously undrilled area between the existing mineralization at Altar Central and Altar East. And more importantly, a significant distance from either of those known areas of mineralization. So again, going back to the plan map that I showed you earlier, now I'd like to take you and show you a cross section that's north-south, BP prime, and we'll be looking towards the east in these series of sections. And what I've shown here is you can see the historic drilling. You can see this large magnetotelluric resistivity feature or conductivity feature. And you can see where drill hole 223 is drilled. I'll take away the geophysics for a second and put on the grades. This hole hit a very impressive intercept of over 1 kilometer, 1.167 kilometers of 0.8 copper equivalent, dominated by mostly copper, as you can see in the results here. But really importantly is it hit a significant intercept in the bottom 400 plus meters of almost 0.67 copper equivalent. The mineralization in the intercept starts at 120 meters, but there is actually mineralization almost starting from surface, actually at 26 meters. But it wasn't included into the intercept because we thought that it was probably a little bit on the low grade side and would dilute from the overall number here. But there is mineralization basically from 26 meters below surface. Just some quick photos. As many of you know, I'm the rock doctor, and I like to show a lot of rock because I think it's very important that investors understand the rocks and why the rocks are talking to us and why they're important. So I just want to take you through a few photos here to give you an idea of what this hole looks like and why it's got us very excited, apart from just the copper and the moly and the gold grades. And so what we can see here is, like I mentioned, there's about 26 meters of leach cap. That's the area where you can see the rocks are completely stripped of all the copper, and it's just left with this iron oxide staining. And then below that, we start to get into mineralization. And here we can already start to get excited because we're seeing quartz veins here with pretty decent copper grades, and also showing significant molybdenite or moly. Slightly below that, we're starting to see an increase in the amount of stockwork veining. What's very important about this is that there's multiple generations of both quartz and sulfide stockwork veining, and in some places, a lot of chalcopyrite associated with green sericite alteration. And you can see some of the grades here. 0.53 and 0.30. We also start to see an increase in the amount of quartz stockwork and sulfide veining. And again, we can see some good examples here. The other important aspect of hole 223 that's quite different than what we got in hole 221 last year is, if those of you will remember 221, that hole was drilled almost exclusively in wall rocks, both unfavorable rhyolites and more favorable andesites, but was contiguously mineralized. Here, in contrast, the majority of the hole intercepted mineralized porphyry intrusion, which is really what we're hunting for. And you can see the porphyritic texture of the rock here. And again, like I mentioned, this very intense quartz and sulfide stockwork. Also, we can see very favorable alteration that we like to see. And here we can see some early potassic alteration in the brownish color here. That's made up of biotite and secondary K feldspar. That is mineralized. But more importantly, we see that being overprinted here by a very strong green sericite alteration that's carrying abundant chalcopyrite, pyrite, and locally bornite as well. And you can see the grades are starting to pick up when we start to intersect this mineralization. And you can see here's another beautiful example where we have that early potassic alteration here in the pinky brown colors. You can still see the porphyritic texture of the intrusive rock. And then we can see these sulfide chalcopyrite veins and pyrite cutting across with these green sericite halos that are completely destroying the original texture of the rock. And it's hard to see in the photograph, but this is just full of sulfide. So when we start to see this kind of veining intersecting and starting to coalesce, that's when we see an increase in the copper grades, to the point where we start to see more increased quartz veining. We start to see more molybdenite appearing. And then we get down a little bit deeper when we start to get into the higher grades, and we start to see complete obliteration of the original texture of the rock. You can just see in the white areas here some of the original porphyry texture with the stockwork veining. The rest of this is just completely silicified and overprinted by green sericite with abundant sulfides. And you can see the locally areas of very strong chalcopyrite development. And you can see for this particular interval almost running 0.9 copper. Again, moving a little further down the hole, we continue to see these banded veins with high sulfide content. with the sericitic halos, complete destruction of the original porphyry texture. And you can see locally we're getting zones that are running well over 1% copper and significant amounts of moly. As we go a bit deeper, we're still in quite good grade. Again, we see the intensification of this green sericite alteration, overprinting potassic biotite alteration, and a lot of very fine disseminated chalcopyrite and locally hypogene bornite, and also, interestingly, hypogene chalcocite. And you'll remember that both bornite and chalcocite have much higher copper in their crystal structure. So when we start to see those minerals, that is always a good omen that you need a lot less tons to get a lot more copper. And then getting towards the bottom of the hole, we're still seeing very interesting grades, very good moly, and again, this strong overprint of this green sericite on the earlier potassic alteration. Both the potassic alteration and the green sericite alteration both carry copper mineralization. So if we now look at that same section, what I've plotted here is the block model from the 2021 resource model, copper equivalent, and I'm showing the in-pit blocks, and you can see where drill hole 223 is in relation to the existing blocks that report to the resource model. And I've superimposed here slightly transparently so that you can see where that large geophysical anomaly is. And again, remember the mineralization here, and you can see there's still a large part of this geophysical anomaly. And again, the scale bar down here, each of these blocks is about 750 meters long by 750 meters high. So moving on back to our plan map again, I'd now like to switch over and look at hole 222. Although hole 22 on the face of it doesn't look quite as sexy as hole 223, in fact, it's also a very significant hole for slightly different reasons. And now I'd like to show you a cross section CC prime, and we'll be looking towards the northeast. So here we are again looking at that very large MT resistivity feature, and you can see where drill hole 222 is drilled relative to that anomaly. And you can see the existing drill holes over here in the Altar Central ore body. So just turning off the geophysics for a second, we can see that the hole, like I mentioned, although not hitting as sexy a grades as we saw in 223, they are nonetheless significant. And they're significant for two reasons. First, this area near the top where you can see all kinds of chatter in the colors here because there's lots of little narrow intervals of interesting copper grade, of which there was one that kind of held together that we reported, but you can see there's spiked all the way through this portion of the in pit, is that basically top 400 meters, which is inside the pit, has a lot of lower to medium grade mineralization, very choppy, but nonetheless is drilled in an area that currently is not classified in the resource model and therefore is called undefined waste due to the lack of previous drilling. And then obviously the lower intercept here of almost 378 meters of 0.46 copper equivalent is very significant because of where it's located. It's a significant step out from any known mineralization here at the main Altar Central ore body. So if we just quickly have a quick look, a lot of this mineralization near the top of the hole is dominated by what we would call high sulfidation style copper mineralization. There's pyrite and energite. As we move down the hole, we actually see there's areas that have got very, very nice high grade intercepts. And we also start to see very telltale signs that we could be approaching something more interesting when we start to see the presence here of tourmaline, the black mineral, and some of the, again, this more sericitic alteration. As we go a bit deeper, we start to get in very, very similar analogous looking rocks that I showed you in hole 223, where we can see earlier potassic alteration here in andesitic host rocks, and that's being overprinted by this, again, green sericite that has a lot of very fine chalcopyrite disseminated in that green sericite halos. And you can see some of the grades we're getting here. This was within rhyolite, and we're still almost 0.46 copper. Again, not a very good host rock normally. And then when we get into the andesites, which are much better host rocks, we see the grade jump to almost 0.66. And again, significant moly associated with this as well. And then finally, towards the bottom of the hole, we start seeing telltale signs that we're nearing probably a porphyry intrusion, when we start to see a lot of lavender or purple colored anhydrite with a lot of chalcopyrite associated with it. Here you can see this particular interval is running almost 1.4% copper and 166 ppm moly. And again, here another vein here that's cutting through the andesite with a lot of anhydrite and also chalcopyrite. So if we now again look at the in-pit block model for copper equivalent, we can see where the blocks are, and we can see this area over here has got very little in the way of blocks defined. Some of these blocks up in the top part here are projecting over from another section from some shallow drilling that was done previous to Aldebaran's participation in the project. And so I think you can see that there will be blocks that might be able to be developed here. And clearly towards the bottom of the hole, you can see that once we go into the main part of this geophysical anomaly, we start to get into more interesting looking mineralization. And again, with the idea that we've hit significant mineralization, and that step out from known mineralization here is 300 meters, and from this hole over here is 730 meters. So you can see there's still a large part of this anomaly that needs to be drill tested. So a couple of oblique views. You should be used to seeing these. We've used some of these in previous webinars and presentations. What I'm showing you here now is an oblique view looking towards the southwest. And what you can see is, you can see Altar Central here. This is the radio QDM area over here. You can see the 2021 pit shell, and you can see where drill hole 222 is. And you really start to get a sense of how it's really out there by its lonesome. This is what it looks like. Putting on again the 3D resistivity, and you can see that it's very nice correlation. As soon as the drill hole gets into the main part of that anomaly, the grades pick up, and you can see that that hole ended in mineralization, and so did hole 223 as well. This is now another oblique view, now focusing more on the area where hole 223 was drilled. We're now looking towards the southeast. You can see our camp located here, and you can see the radio porphyry system here, the Altar Central porphyry system here, and the Altar East system here. Here's drill hole 221 that was drilled in between the two. And you can see where hole 223 is, and you can see where now we're drilling two active holes in between those, 224 and 225B. 226 is off and behind here, so we can't see it in this particular view. There's where we are relative to the anomaly. Some of you might ask, well, why did you stop hole 223 so early? We took a decision early on to basically drill to about 1,200 meter depth because we felt that was probably the realistic bottom of any very large open pit that could be demonstratably feasible based on other operations that are currently in South America that have either pits to that depth or are planning to have pits to that depth. And so rather than spending a lot of extra time and a lot of extra money drilling beyond that, we decided it was better to get more holes over a larger geographic area within this very large geophysical anomaly and leave holes hanging in mineralization if there be the case. And so far, both hole 222 and hole 223 both bottomed in mineralization. So what I'm also showing here that's very significant is the blocks that are currently in the resource model. And you can see there's a large area here that could be amenable to being added to the resource model in the future with additional drilling. So to conclude, I just want to show you again another view, because I think this really puts things into kind of perspective a little bit. For me, it did anyway. And now what we're looking at is kind of a cross section that's looking to the north, and we've been able to capture hole 212. That's a hole that we drilled several years ago that went to just over 2 kilometers depth, and is at the moment the deepest hole drilled in Argentina outside of the oil industry. And then you can see where hole 221 is here, and you can see where hole 223 is, and you can see this is the conceptual pit shell. Okay, and what I'm going to throw on here now are the in-pit resource blocks. So you can see that a lot of the better mineralization is sitting just below the current pit shell, and you can see how the pit shell kind of goes up here just because there's a lack of drilling. And to put that into perspective, I've put the geophysical anomaly again in the background here for you to see, and I've put some of the distances between these holes. The distance between hole 221 and hole 223 is a little over 500 meters. That's huge. And the distance between 221 and hole 212 is 700 meters. And you can see there's still favorable looking geophysical anomaly beyond both of those in either direction. Really quite an amazing thing. And so we've intercepted over 1 kilometer of low to moderate grade mineralization in hole 221. That was almost entirely in wall rock. And at the time we indicated that that was a good indication to us that the source could either be Altar East or Altar Central or something else. Hole 223 also now has intercepted over 1 kilometer of moderate to locally high-grade mineralization and represents, as I mentioned, a 500-meter step out from hole 221. And the most important aspect of hole 223 is it's hosted mostly within porphyry intrusion, unlike hole 221. The large gap between 212 and 221, like I said, is still within the favorable geophysical signature. The lower portions of these holes are not currently within the resource model because they fall below the current pit shell and therefore are not included in the resource estimate. Additional drilling is clearly required to infill these huge gaps. And remember, all of these holes ended in mineralization. So I just like to thank you for your attention, and now we'll open it up to questions and answers. And for those of you that are in the Toronto area or are planning to be in the Toronto area next week for the PDAC conference at the Convention Center, I invite you to come visit us at booth 2923 in the Investors Exchange. We will have drill core from hole 223 on display. And we look forward to chatting to some of you in person next week.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you for the great and informative presentation. as you say, we're entering into the Q&A period now. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A chat found on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. But to get started, first question from Nate. Can the hypogene chalcocite encountered in 223 be expanded on? Is causation speculation?
The hypogene chalcocite?
Yes.
Yeah. Hypogene chalcocite is actually quite not that uncommon in some porphyry systems. It typically shows that you've got a depletion in the amount of available iron and an overabundance of sulfur. And so you typically will start to form chalcocite, which is a copper sulfide that doesn't have iron in it. Hence, that's why in chalcocite, we start to see 82% copper in the crystal structure versus chalcopyrite, which is a more common mineral in porphyries, which has 33% copper in its crystal structure because the remaining part is made up of iron. So it's not uncommon to see chalcocite in some porphyry systems.
Fair enough. And Nate actually just has a follow-up question about that. Has it been encountered before? He'd been reviewing available material before, and he just doesn't recall seeing it.
We've seen it in the supergene environment. We've also seen it in the hypogene environment at the radioporphyry, which we've documented in both press releases and in previous webinars. But in the main altar system, hypogene chalcocite has not been recognized very often. It's not as if it's like a super common mineral at this stage, but there's enough of it that it can be recognized with the naked eye or with a hand lens. So it's interesting because, like I said, it does add to the copper grade significantly.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Kevin. Nate has a big question here. I'm going to try and get to the core of it. But effectively, is it a primary objective for you to collect geotechnical data for multiple purposes, including pit wall steepening to achieve additional strip ratio reduction? And just, is this being collected?
I'll make one quick comment about it. We do systematically collect geotechnical information on all of our diamond drill holes. And we do two kinds of geotechnical analysis. We do the more traditional stuff that you'll see in a lot of early stage exploration programs, which is the sort of fracture density and RQD and recovery type analysis. But on top of that, we set up a contract with a third-party company out of Tucson, Arizona, called Nicholas, who are specialists in geotechnical analysis. And they trained all of our geos on how to do more detailed and more thorough geotechnical analysis. And so that is being systematically done on all the holes we drill, apart from the more traditional geological logging, etc.
All right, fair enough. Stephen's wondering, how steep pit walls does the rock competency allow?
Here, we don't have enough information. So the fallback angle that our consultants that are doing our resources and engineering work they're comfortable with 40. However, the rock here is very competent, much more competent than many other projects in our vicinity. And so we'll be working with our third-party consultants to try to get them to maybe steepen up some of those angles. But a typical project at this very early stage is sort of between 40 and 45 degree pit slopes.
Absolutely. Adrian has a question. How much more drilling to fill in the gaps and answer the unanswered questions? What's the expected time scale until sufficient drilling has been accomplished?
I don't know, John, you want to take a stab at that one?
John, you're just muted there.
You're mute, John. John, you're on mute.
We can get at a time.
John, just as a note, you were muted at the start of that. You may want to just restart your answer. You're good to go now.
Yeah, thanks. Great question on this, and this is one of the big challenges we have on the project. It's absolutely exciting that we have such a large anomaly with such a direct correlation between that anomaly and mineralization, but that size will require a lot of drilling. Our indications are now that we'll be able to drill at a drill hole spacing of approximately 200 meters on a grid, but to drill all of that anomaly off is more than we'll be able to accomplish this year. And we will require a good hard field season next year to drill the entire anomaly off and see what we have. Now, having said that, when we're done with this year, we'll take a look to see if we can do an updated resource on this. Keep in mind, if we do that, it will be an interim resource with much more to come as we drill. But all indications are right now it's as much as we can possibly get drilled this season, and probably one more full season to really truly understand the full size of the deposit.
Awesome. Mark just has a question. Specifically, how many more holes are you planning on drilling in 2023? Do you stop for the winter break this year? And are all your plans fully funded?
We're funded for this field season. Keep in mind we have some warrants that are like well in the money and likely to come in May as well, and we're already starting to see some of those come in to fund. So we're in good shape for this field season to continue this program. We projected that we'd be able to drill about 20,000 meters this year. That will be a challenge as the drilling has been a bit slower than we planned on, but starting to pick up now. So we'll do our best to get that drilling done. Our average drill hole depth is going to be 1,000 to 1,200 meters. So we'll probably be able to complete about 8 more holes by the time we're done with this field season.
All right, great. Rizel wants to know if there are any glaciers over the potential pit area and the project's footprint for that matter. What's the altitude range of the project's footprint?
Project's footprint, our camp is at about 3,100 meters. So despite being in the high central Andes, it's not that high where the camp sits at itself. And the top of the project's about 4,200 meters, with much of the mineralization between, say, 3,000 and 4,000 meters. So certainly an elevation where existing mines like Pelambres are operating at efficiently and no issues in that sense at all. With respect to the questions about glaciers, that's a very good question. As many of you probably know, there are laws in Argentina that are aimed at protection of glaciers, and particularly water resources that are associated with glaciers. We have no true glaciers on the project at all. We do have some features that are glacial related features, like what's considered a rock glacier or a dry glacier. We're actively studying those to determine what their implications for water, and they have minimal implications on the water balance overall in the system. And I'd like to point out, for those of you that are familiar with the project in the area we're working on, Pachón, just to the south of us, has very similar setting to what we have, and they've just successfully been able to document that the features that they have do not affect the water balance whatsoever at all, which is the primary objective of the glacial loss. So we're very actively working on that to be able to manage it. We don't see that as an impediment to the development of the project.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Vokusin has 2 questions, so we'll just go one at a time here. But the first is regarding 222 and 223, stop the mineralization. Why stop drilling if you're still hitting mineralization?
The main reason to do that is currently when we look at active pits in South America or planned pits, 1,200 meters is kind of the limit really at this point. In the future, there may be ways to mine beyond that. But also keep in mind, it will take a long time to get to that depth in a pit. So if you're defining mineralization at those depths, you're really defining mineralization that might be mined in 40 or 50 years from now, which is fantastic. It contributes to the value of the project overall, but it doesn't contribute a lot to the NPV of the project. You really want to focus on those earlier stages of the pit. And we don't have a shortage of mineralization in this system by any means at all. So right now it's more important that we get that lateral coverage on our drill holes so that we can define the resource down to 1,200 meters, and leaving mineralization open in the future is just blue sky for an eventual operator.
Great. His next question is, do you expect to be able to eventually steepen pit walls for the new resource?
I think Kevin's kind of covered that. In this, what we observe geologically is it's very competent rock. And in many other porphyry systems with similar rock characteristics, they are allowed to go to steeper pit walls. but it's very early days for us. We have no reason to be, the greater concern is if we had to go to flatter walls, which you do when you have highly weathered material or a lot of high sulfidation mineralization and it's very rubbly. That's not the case at all here. And I would also point out that when you plan extremely deep pits, these large, big pits like this, it's natural that the mine planners are conservative on that. That's a lot of high wall to have at a very steep angle. So I think the 40-45 is a good range for us to be looking at right now. There could be potential upside in the future as we move forward.
Absolutely. And do you gather any practical conclusions for your further drilling from increased moly grades at depth?
Kevin, you want to go into that one?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I mean, there is high moly. It could be due to a number of different. We know we've got multiple overprinting porphyry mineralizing events. We're currently, there's been a lot of research that's been published on Altar by PhDs and other academics that demonstrate that there's quite a long range of ages. So we got a lot of overprinting of different porphyry centers, one on top of the other. The moly getting greater at depth. I mean, other deposits where that happens is Bingham Canyon in Utah, where there's quite a large moly concentration in towards the bottom of the Bingham pit. And it's always been, I'm not privy to what Rio Tinto's done. I imagine they've probably drilled some deep holes under there, and I don't know what they found, but maybe it's the moly shell on another nested porphyry down deep, but it's beyond what we're necessarily exploring for here right now.
Kevin, it might be worth mentioning what we know about the rhenium contents on the moly too.
Yeah, we've got a PhD student who's currently studying molybdenite, and he's doing a lot of rhenium and osmium age dating, so we can get actual ages from the molybdenite on the age of the mineralization. That's kind of the academic side of things. But what's really important about that is in the process of using rhenium and osmium, they actually have to measure the rhenium contents. And some of the initial samples that have been done at Altar show that there's very, very high rhenium contents in the moly, to the point where some of the samples are probably in the top 5 or 10% rhenium content in porphyries worldwide. And so other deposits to look at that also have similarly high rhenium are like Cerro Rita in Arizona, and also the large Cerro Verde porphyry system near Arequipa in Peru. So it's something that in the future could be a very significant value add, but it's still very, very early days. And so I don't want to put the cart ahead of the horse here too much.
No, fair enough. You mentioned that hole 222 encountered mineralization in an area within the 2021 conceptual open pit shell that's currently classified as undefined waste. To what extent could in-pit shallower drilling in this area help lower the strip ratio?
It could be very significant. We've put together some initial plans to look at trying to. I mean, it's a huge area, and the pit is giant, just as it is right now. So it take a lot of drilling to drill off that undefined waste. So we're in the process right now of trying to see, are there certain areas that for geological or for geophysical or for geochemical reasons might have a higher percentage chance to have success. And so we're planning to do that. And but whether we get to those kind of holes this year, our focus is on, like John mentioned, these holes we're drilling right now. We're into mineralization. I think the focus has to be on trying to get enough holes into that geophysical anomaly at an adequate spacing that we might have a chance to do an interim updated resource after this campaign. But there's still some ifs involved with that.
Cam, that reminds me, I don't think we completely answered one of the previous questions in terms of length of field season. We currently plan to drill as late as we can before we get hit with heavier snowfalls. That in the last few years has been right around the early part of June. And then we will most likely take a break and not drill for 3 or 4 months during the heart of the winter. We're well aware that some of our neighbors are making plans to try to drill all winter, and some attempted to do that last year with variable success. It's certainly less efficient. Not only are you fighting snow removal, but you're fighting keeping water liquid to be able to drill with, and you become much less efficient. So our current plan is to take a break for a few months, but to keep that as short as possible and be back into the project, and currently planning September, October of next year.
All right, fair enough. Jim has a question, just asking if you could comment about the use of copper equivalent info. His understanding is that the exchange had recently made some changes about the manner in which equivalency info could be shared.
I'll take a stab at that. Got a slide prepared here because I was expecting somebody. It's not that the exchange has changed rules. The rules are not spelled out, but they're alluded to in other accompanying documents to 43-101. And what the exchange is getting more, I think, harder on is groups using equivalencies and not applying reasonable metallurgical recovery. So what I've done here is I've shown that when we first started reporting, we were reporting using our copper equivalent, using these kinds of metrics of prices. This is all stated in our press releases. But in this time period, we made no adjustments for recovery, as we thought it was an early stage project and there were multiple metallurgical pathways forward. And so this was the formula we're using. After discussions with the exchange, they weren't particularly happy about that. And it's not just with us. And so they said that because we have some historical metallurgical work, that we should be using those to apply to the minerals or the elements that we're using in the equivalency. So based on historical metallurgical test work at Altar, there's the results, whether you like the results or you don't like the results, and that's open to debate. This is not work that we did, but is roughly 50% recovery on the gold and 51% on the silver. So we've applied those now to our copper equivalent calculation. And because there has been no metallurgical recovery work done on moly, then the next best thing is to benchmark against similar other deposits that have moly in the same way, other porphyry deposits, copper, moly porphyries. And typically based on that, we arrived at 70% as probably a good benchmark for the moly recovery. And so this is the new formula. And just to show, I've just done a really simple example here to show what kind of an effect the difference has, is if we just assume that we had 1 gram of gold, 1% copper, 10 grams of silver, and 100 ppm, that would give us a 1.8 copper equivalent, assuming 100% recovery of all those elements, using, like I said, $3 copper, 1,400 gold, 18 silver, and $10 moly. So if we then now use the exact same inputs for the grade, but now we apply these new recovery factors, 50% for gold, 51% for silver, and 70% for moly, the copper equivalent grade comes out to 1.4. So there is a reduction, but it's not a huge reduction. And the reason why is because in Altar Central and Altar East, it's dominantly a copper dominated ore body. Where this will become more critical is if you were in an ore body where you have equal amounts of copper and gold. Obviously the gold will get penalized quite severely. And so in the exchange's mind is, I think this is legitimate and can be supported. If we were to move over to the copper gold dominant system at radio, we would probably have to apply these kinds of recoveries. It's a bit frustrating on our part because these rules are not spelled out exactly, and not all groups out there respect them. But we're trying to be good corporate citizens here and do things the right way. But I think what you'll see is that moving forward, the exchange will start to come down on more companies regarding the use of copper equivalents or gold equivalents, or there's a ton of other equivalencies out there that people tend to use. So I hope that answers the person's question regarding copper equivalency.
No, fair enough. Thanks, Kev.
Yeah, and we'd be more than happy to discuss that with anybody, particularly if you stop by the booth next week or something, just to do it. But what is important as investors is to pay attention when you look at results and see whether metallurgical factors have been applied to those.
Right. Another question, there was a recent investment by Stellantis in McEwen Copper, which suggests a high valuation of their Los Azules project. Could this be a financing path that Aldebaran takes in the future?
I can take a stab at that one. It's very exciting that we're seeing some non-traditional players enter into the space right now. We've seen it in the lithium space with groups like Tesla and GM and others coming in. Now we're seeing automakers like Stellantis. Stellantis is a group that owns quite a number of different well-known auto names. And what they're concerned about is securing a supply of copper in the future. They see, as we move to more electrical vehicles going forward, that there's going to be an extreme shortage of critical metals like copper, nickel, lithium. And so they're taking steps to move directly to secure supply. So it's not just simply an investment in McEwen Copper. It's an investment that comes with a clause that stipulates that they have an offtake agreement on that. So they're securing metal source. From our perspective, that just increases the pool of potential investors to finance the type of work we have or to acquire our projects when they're drilled out. So it's very good news for us. We're hearing that major conferences like the BMO conference this week, or say CESCO conference coming up in Chile in April, are seeing a large number of battery makers and automakers and other big industrial groups starting to participate in traditional mining and metal conferences. And that's because they want to make sure they can secure supply moving forward. So that's fantastic news for us. More specifically related to our project, we'll have to evaluate on what are our best opportunities going forward. We already have 3 very significant strategic partners on the project, and they're very willing to help us move the project forward as we advance a project like that. Whether there's room for an additional party to come in at this stage or not, we'll make our best call as those opportunities appear.
No, fair enough. That sounds fair to me. Thanks, John. Another question: what measures have you taken to address the previously mentioned issues with drilling contractors at the project?
Kevin, you want to mention what we're doing there?
Yeah, we've recently contracted a drill specialist. It's a person that comes with a lot of years of experience working with Barrick Gold in South America. It's a personal friend of mine. We've hired them on a contractual basis to come and review what's going on with our operators and help us to understand where there might be areas to improve, and also to maybe help some of the drillers as well to maybe do things differently as well. So that person is actually physically up at the project site as we are speaking, and so we should know within the next couple of weeks what his findings are.
Great. So the more that you're drilling and getting to know this project, the question is, what active mines in South America would you compare this one to?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, it's always a bit dangerous to make direct comparisons because every one of these projects has its own nuances and slight differences. But in terms of potential size and scale, I've mentioned this in previous webinars. The one that looks real close to me in terms of the size, the grade, is Cerro Verde that is run by Freeport McMoran in Peru near Arequipa. That's a very, very large, it's probably one of the largest throughput mines in the world. It's number 5 ranking in terms of copper produced every year in the world. And they're mining very low to moderate grade there. The average grade they're mining there is about 0.35 copper. So there does become a point, and I've said this before, that size does matter. And it's kind of like the analogy I would give people is that it's kind of like Walmart. Walmart doesn't have big margins, but they got huge volume. And the volume on those margins starts to make a big difference. As opposed to ma and pa sitting on their corner store where they might have pretty high margins, but they don't have very much volume. And so there is a tipping point, and I'm not saying that we're necessarily at that tipping point here yet at Altar, but I think these recent results are starting to show us that Altar Central and Altar East might actually be one large deposit, a mega deposit, and we might have to rename it to Altar United.
All right, well, fair enough. Listen, John, Kevin, I want to thank you for coming on today and going through such a great Q&A session. Unfortunately, great Q&A sessions like today are double-edged because we do have a lot of questions that have gone unanswered. So I want to apologize to everyone we weren't able to get to today. However, I will be passing your questions on to the team so that they can follow up later. We do have a survey in the chat that you can fill out if you want to get in contact with the team, so feel free to engage with that. And as I mentioned, today's recording is going to be available in the coming days, so look out for that if you want to refresh on today's content. But with that, John, Kevin, I want to pass things over to you just before we wrap up for any closing remarks you might have.
Okay, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I think this is really exciting. Like I said right at the beginning, I'm obviously an explorationist and an officer of the company, but I'm also a shareholder. And these results are significant. And I'm very excited. And don't be surprised if I'm buying some shares if nobody else wants to buy any.
Okay, well, great. And thanks once again, Cam, for providing this format for us. And as you can tell from Kevin's presentation, we're incredibly excited about these results. I can't think of a better time to have our hands on an extremely large copper deposit in a jurisdiction that's welcoming us to work and encouraging us to move forward quickly. We have very few restrictions on how we move forward permit-wise. We do have some challenges on how we get enough drill rigs and drillers and geos to keep things going, but we'll get those solved as we move forward. And in addition to having our hands on a great deposit, as you can see today, the evidence is showing that this is about to turn into a significantly larger deposit moving forward. So I couldn't be more pleased and to have our hands on a project like this at a moment like this when I think we'll see copper break out significantly in the next year or two.